What if the greatest danger to humanity was not evil itself, but stupidity? Not the common stupidity we associate with ignorance or lack of intelligence, but a much quieter, more pervasive and devastating form: collective stupidity. The inability to think for oneself, the emptiness that sets in when we surrender our consciousness to the flow of a mass that acts, speaks, and believes for us. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a theologian and philosopher who lived through the darkest years of the 20th century, dared to say that stupidity is more dangerous than evil itself. An uncomfortable statement, because it forces us to admit that history's greatest disasters may not have arisen solely from wicked hearts, but from the unconscious passivity of millions of people who dared not question. Bonhoeffer knew what he was talking about. Imprisoned for opposing the Nazi regime, he observed from within dark cells how seemingly ordinary citizens, neighbors, friends, workers, became complicit in a system of terror. Not because they were all monsters, but because many had stopped thinking. Because they repeated slogans, because they believed convenient lies, because they confused security with obedience. And then, the question arises that echoes to this day: do we still live under the tyranny of stupidity? Could it be that, in the 21st century, with the most advanced technology in history, with infinite libraries in the palm of our hands, we continue to repeat the same mistakes? Perhaps in even more sophisticated, even more sneaky ways. After all, look around. What do we see? A society where millions spend hours swiping their fingers across glowing screens, consuming fabricated content, furiously debating headlines they haven't read, sharing opinions they haven't formed. People who confuse information with wisdom and speed with depth. What Bonhoeffer called stupidity is perhaps the norm today. Stupidity doesn't need to raise its voice. It doesn't need to shout, threaten, or impose itself through violence. Often, it disguises itself as conformity, neutrality, even virtue. Stupidity isn't necessarily aggressive, it's docile. And precisely for this reason, it becomes a perfect channel for evil. As Bonhoeffer wrote, "Against evil we can protest, denounce, resist. But against stupidity, there is no argument that suffices." And here we arrive at the paradox that permeates the entire human experience. We have never been so connected, and at the same time, we have never been so easily led by the collective. We have never had so much access to information, and never been so vulnerable to manipulation. The danger of stupidity is not only in those who blindly follow orders, but also in us. Every time we forego critical reflection in the name of comfort, haste, social acceptance. Perhaps this is what scares us most. Realizing that stupidity isn't something external, a visible enemy we can point out. It infiltrates our routine, our repeated discourse, our unquestioned conviction. It lives within us, lurking whenever we choose the easy shortcut over deep thought. And it is at this point that Bonhoeffer's reflection becomes timeless. His theory is not only a warning about the past, about the rise of Nazism, but a mirror held before each generation. Today, the mirror is reflected in social media, in political polarization, in the cult of empty entertainment, in the growing inability to sustain silence and introspection. So this video isn't about the past. It's about now. It's about you and me, about the way we live, about the quality of our thinking and our consciousness. Because if Bonhoeffer was right, and everything indicates that he was, then the greatest threat to humanity lies not in the calculated evil of the few, but in the unconscious passivity of the many. And perhaps there remains only one question which will guide all this reflection. How can we resist stupidity without falling into the trap of becoming part of it? What if the greatest danger to humanity was not evil, but something much more subtle, silent, and collective? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a thinker who confronted Nazism, believed that stupidity was more dangerous than evil itself. Not because it was more cruel, but because it spread invisibly, turning ordinary people into unwitting accomplices in systems of destruction. Today, in a world saturated with information, quick opinions, and beliefs repeated without reflection, Bonhoeffer's warning resonates more relevantly than ever. After all, are we living in a new era of organized stupidity? In this video we'll explore Bonhoeffer's terrifying theory, what it means, how it manifests in our time, and what it reveals about the fragility of the human mind in the face of the collective. Subscribe to the channel if you are enjoying the video and leave your like so I know you like videos like this. To understand the power of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's words, we must first understand who he was. Because this isn't just a theory put forward by an academic far removed from reality. No. What Bonhoeffer wrote was born from a direct collision with human darkness, and from his conscious decision not to remain silent. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born in 1906 into an intellectual family in Germany. From an early age, he immersed himself in the world of theology, but his faith was never dogmatic or blind. He refused to accept a religion limited to empty rituals and traditions. For him, spirituality should be alive, connected to the concrete reality of the world and the moral choices we make every day. When Nazism began to rise in Germany, many preferred silence. Others, more cowardly, openly aligned themselves with the regime, including many in the churches which traded the gospel for propaganda. But Bonhoeffer was one of the dissenting voices. He denounced the church's complicity, criticized the manipulation of the masses, and refused to accept the normalization of terror. For him, it was not enough to believe in principles. One had to live by them even at the cost of one's life. And it cost. Bonhoeffer participated in the resistance against Hitler. He engaged in risky plans, publicly defended persecuted Jews, and even when he could have escaped, living comfortably outside Germany, he decided to return, aware that his place was in the midst of darkness. He knew that bearing witness from afar would be a form of cowardice. In 1943 he was arrested by the Gestapo. 2 years later, in April 1945, just weeks before the collapse of the Third Reich, Bonhoeffer was hanged in a concentration camp. His last recorded words were simple and devastating: "This is the end, for me the beginning of life." And it is inside prison, facing the imminent end, that he writes one of his most disturbing reflections, The Theory of Stupidity. He realizes that the greatest danger lies not only in the cruel leaders, but in the passive crowd that follows them. Not only in the conscious hatred of the few, but in the unconsciousness of the many. That's what gives weight to your words. He did not speak as a distant philosopher but as someone who observed, in the flesh, neighbors, friends and ordinary citizens becoming cogs in a monstrous machine. Not because they were bad but because they had stopped thinking. And here is the crucial point. Bonhoeffer did not see stupidity as an insult, but as an existential and collective condition. A state in which the human mind, weakened and surrendered to the group, becomes incapable of self-judgment. Bonhoeffer did not live to see liberation. But he left a warning. If we want to understand how entire societies can plunge into the abyss, we need to look not just at the tyrants who lead them, but at the collective stupidity that sustains them. And perhaps the most uncomfortable question is this: to what extent does this same logic continue to be alive in our own time? When we think of the horrors of the 20th century, the concentration camps, the massacres, the wars, it's tempting to imagine that everything was orchestrated solely by the cruelty of evil men. Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, names that have become symbols of absolute evil. But Bonhoeffer saw something else. For him, the true driving force behind these catastrophes was not just the conscious evil of a few, but the silent unconsciousness of many. He wrote, "Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy than evil." But what did Bonhoeffer mean by this? First, a misunderstanding needs to be cleared up. The stupidity he spoke of has nothing to do with a lack of intelligence. It's not synonymous with stupidity. Many of those who became instruments of totalitarian regimes were educated people, even brilliant in their fields. The problem wasn't a lack of intellectual capacity, but a renunciation of critical reflection. Stupidity, for Bonhoeffer, is a state of dormant consciousness. It's when the individual ceases to be an individual and begins to think, or rather, not think, through the collective. It's when ideas cease to be examined and are merely repeated. It's when the mind becomes receptive to slogans, dogmas and orders without resistance. And here is the crucial point: we can still fight against evil. With conscious evil we can dialogue, negotiate, denounce, even fight. But against stupidity, nothing works. The stupid doesn't accept arguments. They aren't convinced by evidence, they don't change their minds in the face of logic. They are, by definition, closed to dialogue. Evil still preserves a certain rationality, the wicked know what they are doing. Stupidity, on the other hand, is irrational and impervious. There is no bridge between reason and a mind that refuses to think. For Bonhoeffer, this made stupidity an infinitely more dangerous force. Because while evil can still be identified and confronted, stupidity spreads silently, cloaked in normalcy, inhabiting ordinary, smiling, seemingly harmless people. She doesn't need to conspire in the shadows. She acts in broad daylight, sustaining entire structures of oppression without the majority realizing their own complicity. And here, perhaps, lies the most disturbing part. Stupidity is not just an individual flaw, but a social phenomenon. Bonhoeffer noted that when alone, many people retained a certain critical sense. But when placed in a group, under pressure from the masses and authorities, they became incapable of thinking for themselves. Stupidity thrives in the collective. It's a product of surrendering autonomy in the name of safety, acceptance, and belonging. In other words, no one is born stupid. We become stupid when we surrender our inner freedom to the comfort of being led. Bonhoeffer saw this clearly in the 1930s and 1940s. Neighbors who had previously thought for themselves began repeating Hitler's words as if they were divine truths. Educated citizens became instruments of propaganda. Entire churches preferred silence to courage. And not because they were all wicked, but because they no longer dared to think. Bonhoeffer's great warning is that this dynamic is not limited to Nazism. It is a perennial temptation for humanity. Whenever a society faces crisis, whenever fear sets in, whenever the desire to belong overcomes the courage of individuality, stupidity becomes fertile. Therefore, his theory is not just a historical analysis, but a mirror that we can, and should, hold up to ourselves. And then the inevitable question arises. Could it be that the stupidity that Bonhoeffer saw in the darkest years of the 20th century continues to govern us today, only under new masks? Bonhoeffer observed something disturbing. In isolation, many people were still able to think clearly. But once immersed in the collective, something changed. The mind dissolved into the group, consciousness faded, and what once seemed obvious became invisible. Stupidity, for him, was not a biological trait or a personal destiny. It was a social phenomenon, a product of the forces that push us toward conformity. It is when we give in to the temptation of not carrying the weight of individual thought, of letting others decide for us. Bonhoeffer's insight echoes other great minds who reflected on crowd psychology. Gustave Le Bon, back in the 19th century, warned that when an individual becomes part of a crowd, they lose some of their critical consciousness. The crowd hypnotizes, simplifies, and creates an emotional field where irrational ideas can flourish without resistance. Carl Jung, in turn, spoke of collective shadow, the dark side of the human psyche that manifests itself when individual responsibility dissolves into group anonymity. Bonhoeffer, however, went further. He saw that collective stupidity arises not only from emotional irrationality, but from voluntary surrender. It is as if the individual said to himself, "I don't need to think. Someone has already thought for me." And in this surrender lies the danger. In times of crisis, this tendency intensifies. Fear, uncertainty, and the search for security make human beings more susceptible to prepackaged speeches. The leader's strong voice replaces inner doubt. The group's opinion replaces the solitary effort to reflect. And little by little, consciousness settles and fades. Bonhoeffer saw this in Nazi Germany. It wasn't just the fanatics who fueled the system, but also ordinary citizens who preferred to go with the flow rather than resist. Stupidity, therefore, was not just a character defect, but a collective symptom. A state in which inner freedom is suspended, and the individual becomes a reflection of the whole. If we look at the present, we realize that this dynamic does not belong only to the past. Today, it manifests itself in other forms. In digital bubbles, in political discourses that repeat themselves like mantras, in simplistic narratives that replace the complexity of reality. How often do we see intelligent, educated people repeating speeches without reflection? How often do we find ourselves defending ideas not because we've thought deeply about them, but because they resonate within the group we want to belong to? This is the paradox. The more we seek the security of being with others, the more vulnerable we become to the contagion of collective stupidity. And this brings us to a crucial question. If Bonhoeffer was right, how can we recognize in ourselves the moment when we stop thinking for ourselves? Perhaps this is where his warning takes on weight. It is not enough to point out stupidity in others, we need to recognize it in ourselves. Every time we repeat without question, every time we prefer the comfort of group opinion to the silence of reflection, every time we stop sustaining doubt in the name of acceptance, we are giving in to the same phenomenon that Bonhoeffer denounced. And perhaps this is the most frightening dimension. Realizing that collective stupidity is not an external enemy, but a constant temptation within each of us. It's easy to look back and imagine that collective stupidity was a phenomenon restricted to dark times, like Nazism or other dictatorships. But the truth is more uncomfortable. What Bonhoeffer described doesn't just belong to the 20th century, it belongs to the human condition. And if before stupidity spread through inflammatory speeches in public squares or through newspapers controlled by the regime, today it spreads through something even faster and more invisible: the internet. We live in an age where information seems infinite. Anyone can access, in seconds, the near total sum of human knowledge. But paradoxically, this abundance hasn't made us wiser, it's made us more vulnerable. Because information is not synonymous with thought. And speed is not synonymous with depth. Social media has created a breeding ground for what Bonhoeffer called stupidity. People repeat cliches, share news without checking, defend ideas as if they were dogma, not because they've thought them through deeply, but because they belong to the narrative of the group they identify with. Like the share, their tweet, they've become modern substitutes for reflection. Just look at what happens in online debates. There's rarely any listening, almost never any real dialogue. What we see is a succession of slogans, attacks, and automatic responses. The individual does not speak as an individual. He speaks as a representative of a collective. He is the mouth through which the tribe expresses itself. And the stronger the desire to belong, the more fragile autonomy becomes. This is why we see educated, intelligent people reproducing superficial narratives, as if they had been programmed. The algorithm reinforces what you already believe, the digital community validates your identity, and critical thinking gives way to the comfort of unanimity. This is not much different from what Bonhoeffer witnessed in his time. Of course, we do not live in an explicit dictatorship like Nazism, but the dynamics of the human mind remain the same. Whenever we give up reflection in exchange for belonging, whenever we exchange doubt for collective certainty, whenever we accept being led by noise instead of sustaining the silence of consciousness, stupidity finds space to flourish. And perhaps it is even more dangerous today. Because, in the past, authoritarian regimes needed to control newspapers, radio stations, and schools to spread their ideas. Today, censorship isn't necessary. Distraction already fulfills that role. The excess of voices, stimuli, and opinions creates a cacophony that numbs thought. We are not controlled only by what we hear, but by the incessant rhythm of stimuli that prevents us from thinking. Bonhoeffer said that stupidity is more dangerous than evil because it is invisible, because it does not recognize itself. Perhaps, if he lived today, he would say that the greatest weapon of contemporary stupidity is permanent distraction. We no longer need charismatic leaders shouting slogans in public squares. Now, we have screens that flash, notifications that beep, content that follows one another in seconds. And the result is the same: the mind surrenders and the individual ceases to be his own master. What is at stake, therefore, is not just the risk of totalitarian regimes, but something more intimate: the gradual loss of our inner freedom. And if we think honestly, how many times have we found ourselves defending something not because we deeply believe in it, but because it was the discourse of the group to which we belong? How many times have we repeated without reflecting, reacted without considering, accepted without questioning? Stupidity, as Bonhoeffer said, is not only in others. It starts with us. And recognizing this is perhaps the first step in not succumbing to it. For Bonhoeffer, stupidity wasn't just a political problem. It was a disease of the soul. A kind of inner numbness that goes beyond ignorance and touches the very essence of our existence. Because when we give in to stupidity, we're not just giving up critical reflection, we're giving up ourselves. We cease to be authentic individuals and become copies, reflections, shadows of the collective. Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher who so influenced existential psychology, said that the greatest human despair is to live without being oneself. It's to live numb, resigned, trapped in roles and expectations we didn't consciously choose. And isn't that exactly what collective stupidity does? It robs us of the ability to think for ourselves, turning us into characters in a play we didn't write. Carl Jung in turn spoke of Shadow, the set of rejected and unrecognized aspects of our psyche. When we do not look within, when we do not face our own contradictions, these repressed forces emerge collectively, coming to life in the masses. Stupidity, in this sense, is the shadow in action. Not reflected, not integrated, but projected and repeated unconsciously. And the consequences of this are devastating, not just for entire societies but for each of us individually. Stupidity makes us accomplices without realizing it. It gives us the illusion of belonging but at the price of authenticity. It offers us security but at the cost of inner freedom. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps, said that human beings can endure any suffering as long as they find meaning in it. But stupidity steals exactly that, meaning. Because when we stop thinking for ourselves, when we live only as an echo of the group, we lose the most essential experience of existence: the awareness of being agents of our own choices. And the most tragic thing is that this loss is rarely noticed. A person immersed in stupidity does not feel imprisoned. On the contrary, he often feels relieved. She no longer carries the weight of doubt, responsibility, or existential angst. She has outsourced the burden of thinking. But this relief is an illusion. Behind it lurks the silent death of individuality. This is where Bonhoeffer's warning meets the human paradox. What makes us free also condemns us to anguish. Thinking for ourselves requires courage, it requires enduring loneliness, it requires facing uncertainty. And many prefer to give up this freedom in the name of convenience. However, by choosing this path, we open the door for stupidity to become a collective force. And as Bonhoeffer already warned, there is nothing more dangerous for humanity than a multitude of individuals who have given up thinking. This is the deepest psychological consequence, the dissolution of the self. The human being ceases to be the subject of his own life and becomes the object of external forces that manipulate him. He no longer lives, he is lived. And perhaps this is the greatest challenge of our era, to rescue the courage to think in the midst of a world that rewards haste, conformity, and superficiality. Because, in the end, the question Bonhoeffer poses to us is not just political but existential. Are you still able to think for yourself? Dietrich Bonhoeffer did not survive to see the end of the tyranny he faced. But his voice, written on scraps of paper inside a cell, has passed through time as a warning, perhaps more urgent today than in his own time. What he called stupidity is not just a historical condition, but a constant possibility. It infiltrates small daily choices, when we accept without question, when we prefer to repeat rather than reflect, when we exchange the anguish of doubt for the anesthesia of consensus. And this is where his theory meets the heart of existential philosophy. Human freedom is not a comfortable gift, but a burden. Thinking for yourself is dangerous, it requires courage, it can isolate us. But not thinking is infinitely more dangerous. Because by giving up this responsibility, we hand the world over to those who know how to manipulate crowds. Bonhoeffer knew that evil is strong. But he also knew that stupidity is even more resilient. It cannot be destroyed by violence, nor by logical arguments. It only dissolves when the human being awakens, when he decides, despite the fear and the cost, to recover his own consciousness. And perhaps this is precisely the challenge he throws at us from the depths of the prison. It is not enough to resist evil. We must also resist the temptation of unconsciousness, the seductive invitation to live like a crowd, to think with other people's minds, to give up our own freedom in the name of security. The question that remains, therefore, is not about Germany in 1940, but about us here and now. Are we really thinking for ourselves or just reproducing what the world wants us to think? Are we protagonists of our own consciousness or just extras in a story written by others? Bonhoeffer left us a somber warning, but also a quiet hope. True strength lies in lucidity. And as long as there is someone willing to think, reflect, and resist stupidity, humanity still has a chance. If this reflection made you pause for a moment, perhaps it's because part of you needed to hear it. Subscribe to the channel and continue this journey with us. Here we seek more than answers. We seek the questions that can change the way you see life.